In this chapter, chapter 2, we're finishing up our review of material you would have learned in Econ 130. And we're just going to kind of quickly talk about supply and demand. I'm not going to talk about it in great depth, only because um, I want to balance those of you who just want a very quick review of the concepts versus those of you who might need a bit more work. Um, the idea being that if you know you need a bit more work, you're going to reach out to me individually and say, hey, I really don't remember a lot from supply and demand. It was so long ago when I took it, or I took it with you and you're such a horrible teacher. I need a different resource or something like that, right? And then I will work with you individually to do that necessary review. Okay, and let's look at this as a slideshow here. Okay, so why does an economics course always kind of start off with supply and demand? Well, it goes back to what I was talking about in the previous chapter. It Supply and demand is so important because it is what gives us the price of a product, right? That if we um, we draw out a market for a product, let's say oranges, written in red, that as we kind of remember here, right, that we have a demand which represents people needing oranges to eat. I don't know, do whatever they do with oranges. And that on the opposing side, we have the growers, the supply. And that we then focus on where those two curves meet, giving us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And that things become interesting if there's a drought and orange trees die, where it shifts the supply curve, thus increasing the price, or more land opens up that can grow more oranges, so the supply increases, thus lowering the price. Or we can think of demand changing and it altering the price. But that's really the importance of supply and demand. Is it helps us understand how the world changes. So the kind of the first bullet point here, predicting how changing conditions can affect the price. Well, you see that right here, right? I did two things that could have affected supply, could have done it that affected demand, but we could then predict what would happen to the price. And alternatively, we can evaluate the impact. That's a very nice way to say it. Evaluate the impact of government price controls. Well, if you listen to my last chapter's lecture, where I said that minimum wage was a bad idea, um, that's a nice way to say it. Why is it a bad idea? Why am I saying that normative statement? Well, I can back it up, fortunately, with positive analysis and say it creates this huge surplus of workers or unemployment. And I would rather prefer that we not have people without a job, unemployment, than people living with a wage less than what they need. Um, um, but then we could also talk about how taxes, subsidies, and whatnot affect consumers and producers with our supply and demand analysis. So I need to clear this. So let's start with our supply curve, our kind of basic definition and how it looks. The supply function, supply curve, is describing the relationship between the price of the product and what a producer would be, how much a producer would be willing to produce at that price. And that there's a positive relationship between the two. Basically, that as the price goes up, firms are willing to supply more, and that when the price is lower, firms don't want to supply as much. Thus, it's upward sloping. So we're only talking about what the firm is willing to sell, not how much it thinks it could actually sell at that price, but what they would be willing to sell. Now, the supply curve, we can describe movements along the curve. That would be changing the price, allowing all the other conditions to remain the same. Meaning, if that's point A and this is point B, the movement along the curve, A to B, is caused by the fact that the price went up. So the price went up and the quantity increased. That's a movement along the curve. Essentially, our law of supply, even though there's not really a law of supply, but that would be our law of supply. But what's changing here, as you can see here, what is it that causes this? Well, that's a shift of the curve. And that's caused by something other than price changing. How do we get supply to shift out like this? Well, there would be something like here, where, for instance, we change the cost, the production costs, we change technology, we change expectations of future prices, we change one of the other variables that affect the supply curve, other than the price itself. So when we talk about gasoline prices going up because of a war, or gasoline prices going up because of the supply chain being altered, the law of supply is not at work there. Rather, the supply curve has shifted because costs have changed. And for the demand curve, the counter to this, the demand curve is downward sloping. The demand curve reflecting how much of the product the consumer would want based on the price. So when the price is high, when the price is high, the consumer doesn't want as much, and as the price goes down, they want more. That would be a movement along the curve caused by the price falling, which you would generally have been taught is the law of demand. That's just caused by the fact, hey, it's cheaper, I'm going to buy more. As opposed to a shifting of the curve caused by some other condition other than the price changing. Think about what your demand for masks were in December of 2019. Masks were super cheap in December of 2019. I actually had bought some, not because of a pandemic or anything, but because I had just We had just started a kind of a home improvement project, and um, we needed N95 masks because we were worried about like paint and other things and smelling those kinds of things. So we went to City Mill, bought N95 masks in December before the pandemic, and dude, they were really really cheap. And fortunately, I bought more than I needed and didn't return the extras because then just a few months later, the price went up and they were out of stock. Why? That can't be really explained by the fact that we had a movement along the demand curve. Rather, you have a global pandemic shifting the demand curve, causing an increase in the price, encouraging firms to then produce those goods. And that's what you see here. That demand can then shift out based on some factor other than the price changing. So again, difference between shift of the curve versus movement along the curve. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that um, products have relationships to each other. So we have substitutes and complements. Substitutes are goods where they both fulfill a similar need, and complements are goods where you typically need to buy a good in conjunction with some other good. So that would mean that changing the price for that other product then alters the quantity demanded. Um, a good example of that would be that as the price of new cars went up dramatically, it obviously, sorry, that is the, sorry, okay, now you can, okay, sorry. That as the price of new cars went up, from the law of demand, sorry, that the quantity demanded fell, not the demand. Starting to write the wrong thing here. That the quantity demanded falls. In other words, we're moving up along the demand curve. Quantity is falling as the price goes up. But new cars are related to used cars. And if people are buying fewer new cars, we saw this huge increase in the number of used cars that people were willing to buy because new cars and used cars are substitutes for one another. And essentially, what we see is that raising the price of new cars caused quantity demanded of used cars to increase. because of the relationship between these two as substitute goods. And then for complements, you increase the quantity demanded of one good, and then people have to buy more of that other good. So a classic relationship there would be like pencils and erasers, right? If people are buying more pencils, they're going to need more erasers. Or if people buy more pens, they're going to need more paper. Um, if people buy more razor blades, they're going to need that, like the handle for the razor blade or shaving cream. Um, those are goods that are purchased together, um, typically. And so, again, and just to review what we have from chapter one, when we're talking about markets, probably the thing that we critique the most about command economies, meaning like the old Soviet Union or kind of any communist country, is that they typically have shortages and surpluses because the government sets the price incorrectly. And that the beauty again of a market is that the price is set in this case at P0, ensuring that we really don't have too many surpluses and shortages, that the market basically sorts things out appropriately. Because if the market is allowed to exist here, surplus would cause downward pressure on prices. And as the price falls, you would have movement along the demand curve and you would have movement along the supply curve simultaneously until you reach that point. The shortage, what happens when there's a shortage? The price typically goes up, causes upward pressure on prices. And as the price goes up, suppliers supply more, demand also changes. Quantity demanded also changes. Which is why, I'm just going to look at it here. Don't think it'll let me. I bet you there's going to be a news article. I don't even know what it gets grumpy when I'm using the pen. Save mouse, what does that mean? It gets really grumpy when I don't think it listens to me. Well, it won't let me look up anything. Sorry. Well, I bet you if you type in price controls gasoline, the point of what I'm trying to say here is I bet you there's a politician somewhere who's trying to say we need to have price controls. Again, generally not a good thing in terms of the marketplace because it's going to cause, in that case, it's going to cause a shortage of gasoline. A different problem of a different nature. So equilibriums are good things here. Equilibriums um, remove surpluses and shortages. And what we do with that is celebrate the fact that there is competition between workers, that there's competition between producers, that there's competition between consumers, so that we find an optimal price. And when we don't have that competition, What we know is that we still, when there's a lack of competition, we still will get an equilibrium. It's just that the price might be higher than we want it to be, right? So we can complain about the high price of prescription drugs. Since I know I can't search using Google News, if you type in, I forget the name of the prescription drug, but there's a prescription drug for Alzheimer's, which just got developed last year, and that the price is supposed to be something like $10,000 a month, or I think it was supposed to be even more than that. Yeah, it's very expensive, but they're the only company that has that product. So what are you going to do? You can't really. Um, it's not appropriate to um, change the price or not allow that company that developed the drug to not um, to have competition, because then why would they develop the product? Why would they develop any other products? The reason why pharmaceutical companies want to exist is so that they can be a monopolist for at least a short period of time and extract more money. Okay. So again, largely as the review here, then we talk about what's basically called comparative statics, which basically means how do we predict changes in the prices and the quantities based on some other event happening. So here you see that when the supply curve increases, which is what's happening here, shifting to the right, that the equilibrium price falls. So again, this is called comparative stacks. That when supply increases, equilibrium price falls, which you see right here, and that equilibrium quantity rises, which you see right here. And here you see the demand curve increasing. So when demand increases, you see the equilibrium price rising, and we see the equilibrium quantity rising. Okay. And we could imagine that both of those events happen at the same time. And if they do, then we shift the relevant curves and we can see the change in the price here. Here's where drawing things in different colors is generally helpful. But what matters when you change multiple curves is it matters how much you change the curves by. Because as an example here, what happens if I change supply a lot, but I change demand just a little? Then I can get my equilibrium price to fall and equilibrium quantity to rise. Here, as you notice, I was shifting demand more than supply, and I got my price to go up. So look at that. Price went up here, price went down here. And then what if I change them by the same amount? Sorry, I'll use a different color here, I realize. I can get the price to stay the same. And yet the quantity still increases. So in all three cases, the quantity increased. but the price either went up, down, or stayed the same. So when you change two curves, the point of what I'm trying to say here is when you change two curves, you actually need to know how much they are changing by. Depends on the amount of the shift of each curve when you change both curves. In this case, it's of price. It's what we distinguish between ambiguous and unambiguous changes. Um, and if you do a search on Google for comparative statics, you'll see a handy chart that tells you when two curves are shifting. What do we know for certain versus what do we know with uncertainty? Here, what we know for certain is that the quantity will always go up. So that is unambiguous. We know with certainty that quantity will go up. But we need more information to know what will happen to the price. So that is the ambiguous variable because it could go up, down, or stay the same depending on how much the two curves shifted. And so whenever you shift two curves, there's going to be an ambiguous variable and an unambiguous variable. I'm hoping that's not too confusing. And I'm hoping that if you've forgotten some of those things, you'll review your notes or reach out to me and I can give you some of my notes from when I teach the class. In general, I don't. These examples are fine and all, but I just don't want to spend lecture time talking about them because, in general, I don't find the examples that good. um, okay, so I'm just going to skip over these here. Okay. And what that gets us to is a pretty important topic. Um, I would argue probably one of the more useful things that market valuable things that you will learn in economics, and it has to do with elasticity. When you see the word elasticity, I want you to think sensitivity. And by that I mean um, when we lower the price, we know that quantity demanded will go up. Law of demand. The question is how much? In other words, when there's a 1% change in the price, how much percentage change in quantity demanded? We know that if the price goes up, we know that the quantity demanded will fall. But if the price is going up by 1%, the question becomes is is it going to fall by less than 1%? Is it going to fall by equal than 1%? Or is it going to fall by greater than 1%? And if you remember, that's the difference between calling something elastic versus inelastic versus unitary. What's an inelastic good? Oh, mask during a pandemic, a prescription drug, um, gasoline, to be honest, is pretty inelastic. Toilet paper, pretty inelastic. And what that means is that you can raise the price, and people really aren't going to change how much of it they buy. They'll be grumpier about it, but they're really not going to change things. Right now, as I make this lecture, there is a shortage of baby formula. Now, my youngest child, is um, 13 months old. Um, it's like too much information here as I talk about this, but largely used breast milk, and we know that the substitute to breast milk would be formula. And, you know, for those of you who have not had a baby, or you don't have a very younger brother or sister where you would know this, it's that the idea that it's not typical, at least in the United States, that a baby would be solely fed with breast milk. Typically, that's not the case for a variety of reasons, both physical, in terms of production. Some kids just don't. Some kids just don't get into it. They want the formula, the fastness of formula, the whatever formula, um, or working conditions. Right? It takes a lot of time to pump or to feed, and sometimes mothers don't get that time to do that, and it's exhausting. So typically, there's a certain demand for formula, whether you're using it exclusively or not. Oh, dude, you gotta feed your kid though, right? So it's not like, so increasing the price doesn't really alter the quantity demanded. All it does is make people grumpier about paying higher prices. And you really only got to the um, intensity of this current formula crisis by virtue of the fact that there was none on the shelf. Um, what that would mean is that if you make formula, you basically kind of know that you can make the price whatever you want, and you'll be able to sell it. And they're selling an inelastic good, as opposed to the company that makes um, baby food, like smashed up fruit, like Gerber's or something like that. So formula is different than baby food, because in the baby food area, we're talking Gerber's. There's lots of alternatives, and there's a greater sensitivity to price, which is why you see coupons typically for, and we'll talk about that kind of thing. You would see coupons or price reductions for baby food, but not typically for formula, because everyone knows they're going to sell it. Now, despite the fact that here I'm showing you a demand curve that has a constant slope, meaning it's a straight line. So let's say that the slope of this line is, looks to be um, about -2. Well, it's not about -2. You can just look at it right here. And I see that shining. I don't know. You just late at night or early in the morning. So here you can see the demand function written out here. I can see that the slope is constant. The slope is equal to -2. But despite the fact that the slope is constant, what you see here is that the elasticity changes along the curve. Why? Because elasticity is equal to percentage change in quantity demand over the percentage change in price. But how do you calculate percentage change? Well, um, I don't know. I kind of like doing it the new minus old over old kind of calculation. That if you had two numbers, what do you see in this kind of region, this upper region, is that the prices are very high and the quantities are very low. If I change the price by 1 unit, Well, here that would only be like a 25% change, let's say if we were at 4, and I change it by 1, right? To go from 4 to 5 is a 25% change. But at that point, let's say right there, I might be at 1. So what is a 1 unit change there? That's a 100% change. Meaning you get a lot of percentage change here, but not a lot here, which is why the elasticity is much greater as a number in absolute terms as opposed to here. So the reason why the elasticity changes along the curve is the very nature of how you calculate percentages, that it matters where we are along these axes. Okay, let's see. So we can talk about extreme goods where we have infinite elasticity. That would be one where um, as long as the price is, in this case, P star, there's unlimited demand, and at any price other than that, it's completely eliminated. It's pretty extreme, but it's good to know, I guess, theoretically. Because you will see that again. You'll see that when we're talking about perfectly competitive markets. So again, this would be unlimited demand as long as you're charging the market price. You change that price just a little bit, and no one buys your product. Well, as we'll see, that's the very nature of what happens in perfect competition. As long as the firm is charging that price, they can sell as much or as little as they want. And to alter the price, then they find that they can't sell any at all. And that's as opposed to the inelastic demand, where no one cares what the price is. They're always going to buy the same amount. It doesn't matter. So there's inelastic as opposed to elastic demand. Now, there are other elasticities that are important to know, especially if you are in marketing. And that would be, what is your income elasticity of demand and what is your cross price elasticity. So let's say that I was I worked for a used car company, right, that sells used cars, like Carvana or CarMax or one of those. Income elasticity would be pretty important for me to know because I would want to know when people get more money, is it the case that they buy a new car, or is it just that I can sell even newer used cars? Where's that cutoff? Well, to find out where that cutoff is, right? So I'd ask a researcher, go out in the world and tell me if workers are getting $10,000 more a year, do they buy a new car or do they buy a bigger and newer used car? That'd be important to me, right? Because I'm only selling used cars here. I'm Carvana, the company Carvana. Well, how does that researcher find that out? Well, they basically are going to ask questions that determine a consumer's income elasticity of demand. That when I change, sorry, then another way of seeing this would be percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income. When I change this, let's say by 10%, do people buy more used cars? Meaning more expensive or newer cars, or do they not buy my new car or buy my used car because they're buying a new car instead? Whether it's up or down was obviously important to me as a seller of used cars. And then how does that change if I'm like Servco? Because Servco sells both new Toyota cars as well as used cars. So they would actually care about what's called the cross price elasticity of demand, meaning what happens, percentage change in the price of new cars, how does that change the quantity demanded of used cars? And whether that's positive or negative is going to tell me the type of relationship that exists between those two goods. That what we would find is that it would tell us whether the goods are substitutes or complements to each other. In this case, new cars and used cars are substitutes for one another, right? You could get to work in a new car or a used car. But what matters is how strongly they are substitutes for one another, right? Because I could also get to work on the bus, but the demand for bus tickets or whatever is very different because that's a whole different experience riding the bus than it is driving your own car to work. And then we could also calculate the price elasticity of supply, where we look at how sensitive then producers are to changes in price. Um, we don't really need to worry about arc elasticity of demand, so let's not worry about this here. And I'm going to skip this um, example, in this case of the wheat industry. Okay. Um, sorry, I'm just also flipping the sides here. I print it out. Now, one of the key determinants of elasticity is the time frame that we're talking about. And what we tend to see is that as people have a longer time period, they do become more elastic in the long run than in the short run. And so what we see is that typically speaking, the long run demand curve will be flatter than the short run demand curve. Right? So DLR, which is the demand in the long run, is more elastic than demand in the short run. The best example I can give of this would be why did I eventually buy a house? So I lived in faculty housing, which meant that the state was both my employer, which it is, right? But it was also my landlord. And university housing, faculty housing, said that the price was going up and it was, effective basically immediately. Well, dude, there's not much I can do for the next few months, right? I'm not going to find a house right away. I'm not going to pack up all my junk. I'm not like single and like pack everything into my hatchback car. Moving is a big process for me. Got lots of kids, lots of junk to move. And so, right, eventually it started a point where my wife and I had to start looking for a house, right? And then we moved. But that process itself took months, meaning that the longer the time period, I could then basically decrease my demand for rental housing because the price went up. But it didn't change right away. In the example here, they give gasoline. That's probably a better example. But the idea here would be that as the price goes up, people really don't change what they do in the short run in terms of like the size of the car they have. But eventually, it causes them to buy a more fuel efficient car. Ironically, we're not really seeing that. The demand for vehicles has been typically for decades been by bigger and bigger cars. And so I don't even think anything about what the current increase in prices of cars or increase in the price of gasoline has really caused any significant change in the price of the kinds of cars that people are buying. We don't really need to. You don't really need to care about this or this. I don't know why these things don't really matter as much for review. We're not going to use these things as much. Okay. Um, and sorry, like again, I'm skipping through slides, but again, this is hopefully largely review, and I don't want to. I don't want to. I'm just making sure here I'm not skipping anything I really should cover. Okay. Now, what this brings us to in kind of a um, sorry, we've got to flip to the paper slide as well so that I'm not just talking crazy. Is that the last part to this would be again my reliance on um, the market to decide things. As I've already said from chapter one, when we try to impose prices that we think are appropriate, it generally causes problems. Well, there's two types of price controls that we can have. The one would be a price floor. And what a price floor does, it's basically a law that says the price can go no lower than a certain price. So think of like a house, you can go no lower than a floor. You can place the price floor anywhere you want, but um, it's only going to be effective or meaningful if it's placed above the equilibrium. Why? Because if I place it below, it'd be like saying the price for gasoline can go no lower than $1. Costco would be like, dude, that's fine by us. We're charging 5, so we're all good. We're not breaking the law because the law says the price can go no lower than $1, and they're fine. But what if they said the price can go no lower than $10? No lower than $10. Then we as consumers would be forced to pay $10 a gallon, which would mean we wouldn't want to buy that much. And sellers would be like, damn, we can sell it for $10 a gallon? Great. Causing, in this case, a pretty big problem. If it were meaningful. But the thing is, right, that people are still going to try to do things. And so they're going to have to operate outside of the market. The equilibrium will no longer hold. So price floors cause surpluses. Right? If I change this to not be gasoline, but instead I made that the labor market and have the minimum wage here at $10.10 an hour, you now have a surplus of labor. Not a good thing. That would be unemployment. A price ceiling is a law that says the price can go no higher than a certain price. So I need to find the eraser. Sorry, it's a bad way to do this here, but I'm just going to try to save the slide as much as I can. So you can place a price ceiling anywhere you want, but it's only meaningful in this case if you set it lower. Because I could say the price can go no higher than $10 for gasoline. And again, Costco would be fine because they'd be like, dude, we're charging $5, so we're totally within the law. Do what you want. Where the price ceiling would become meaningful is if I said $1. The price can go no higher than $1. So people would buy a lot of gasoline at $1 a gallon, but sellers wouldn't want to sell it, thus causing a shortage. So price floors cause surpluses, price ceilings cause shortages. Thus, in general, price controls are generally a bad thing, causing the market to become distorted. Okay. That basically does it for the review here. At least enough of a review for what we need for this course, because what that does is it then sets the stage then for um, basically all new material with chapter 3, depending on who you had for principles of micro econ 130. If the person covered um, uh, indifference curves and budget constraints, but I'm going to generally assume that we don't really get it's hard to get to that in very much detail. So chapter 3, our next chapter here, you'll find that I'm going to be a little bit more methodical slide by slide in terms of what is covered. Okay.